In the last video, we took a pretty simple plugin and made it into a somewhat complicated class. Now, there are definite advantages to having a class-based plugin, but I wouldn't blame you if you thought, isn't this getting kind of messy? It's true. Having this class jammed into the plugin file like this makes it harder to maintain, especially if you have more than one class for a plugin. And if you want to reuse any of these classes for another plugin, you're going to have to copy them into every plugin file or hope that your plugins are loaded in just the right order. In other words, you're going to have a bad time. If you've guessed that there's got to be a better way of doing it, you're right. It's called autoloading. And we're going to take a look at how we can set that up for this plugin. Our first step is to move this class into its own file. We're going to put it in its very own plugin called app classes. We'll create a file called content type. Now we have a nice, neat file with just one class in it. This plugin, however, currently is totally useless. We'd have to write fragile include logic to let other plugins have access to this class that's over here in this other plugin. And this is the problem that autoloading solves. PHP gives us a function called SPL autoload register, which takes an autoloader function. Whenever PHP encounters a class it can't find, it runs through all registered autoloaders and passes them the full name of the class it's looking for. Each function can handle that class name however it likes. So let's make one of our own. If you noticed, our app classes plugin doesn't have an actual plugin file yet, so we'll create one called init.php. And this is where we can register our autoload function. So like I said, SPL autoload register takes an autoloader function. We want our autoloader to assume that the classes are in this directory. So really, we just need to say, if the file exists, include it, which looks like this. This is a very simple and somewhat fragile implementation of an autoloader. But for instance, what if we want to use namespaces and then organize many classes inside of our app classes plugin, but according to namespaced folders? We need to do a little bit more. If our autoloader gets a namespaced class name, it's going to look something like this. So all we'll need to do is break the string on these escaped backslashes and then look for the file in folders according to the namespaces. So let's just create a variable called segments where we can store the pieces of our namespaced class name. We'll use explode and explode on this escaped backslash. And then I like to actually just wrap this all in array filter. Then, instead of just using the class, we're going to actually need to reassemble the directory structure. So we'll leave this opening slash and then use implode to glue this back together. And we'll still end with .php. For an extra level of organization and safety, I'd like to assume that every class we're going to call that's in this directory begins with the namespace WP plugins. So we'll just shift off the first item in this array and make sure that it's WP plugins. And now we can organize all of the classes inside of our app classes plugin inside of the namespace WP plugins. Back in our content type class file, we now need to add the namespaces that we expect to find here. Based on what we just set up with our autoloader, we need to start with WP plugins for it to register. After that, I'd like to organize these kinds of classes that extend WordPress core functionality inside of a namespace called WP extend. And that's all we need to do to set the class up with the right namespace. But in order for the autoloader to find it, if you remember, we have to use the namespaces as directories because that's where it's going to look. So it's automatically going to look inside of our app classes folder because we used WP plugins. But we need to move content type into a folder called WP extend so it can find that class. And now, when we call the class in our Bootstrap plugin, we need to call it according to its namespace. You may notice a few changes in here that I've made, like pluralizing the name of the content type and then including the singular name instead of the plural name. Don't worry about that right now. We'll get into that in the next few videos. What we need to change now is how we call this class. Instead of calling content type directly, we actually have to use the namespaces that we assigned. The last thing we need to do inside of our Bootstrap plugin is guarantee that our autoloader is registered before this code runs. We'll use WordPress add action, and there's an action called plugins loaded. Once all the plugins are loaded, this function will run. And so by moving our content type creation inside of this, it's now guaranteed that our content types will be created after our autoloader is registered. Now we have an autoloader that's working well. It allows us to pull classes in from other plugins, and it allows us to be sure that the autoloader will be registered before our code runs. However, all those plugins have to be activated for this to work. In the next video, we'll go over 2 easy ways to manage dependencies between plugins so that we can avoid this kind of disaster.